Salutations everybody, it is Matty here today, and I am beyond stoked to tell you about my time with Metaphor Refantazio. I recently traveled to New York City to go hands-on with the game for 2.5 hours. I paid my whole way there. It was right in my backyard, so it was an easy trip. It was hosted at the Renaissance Foundation, which is a perfect location for an event like this. They put concept art from the game on the walls that I literally thought was part of this location itself, but it really wasn't. It just blended perfectly. Like, what a beautiful place to sit down and play some video games. They also had the team from ATLUS on the scene who did a brief Q&A after the fact, but just what a cool event. And I have so much to say on this one because I am a big Persona fanboy, and that is because Persona 5 Royal is the game that made me want to become a game developer. Persona 4 Golden provided me like one of the most healing experiences a video game could provide. And Persona 3, I just look at it, Makoto Yuki, my beautiful edgy boy, I love you so much. Like, I just love what the Persona team does. And so anything ATLUS does, I gravitate toward. It's kind of got that old early 2000s energy where I see their name on the box and go, I'm sure that's peak fiction. So, ladies and gentlemen, like I said, I played 2.5 hours of this game right from the very beginning moments of the game, just starting up a brand new, fresh save file. It was on what looked like an Xbox development kit, and I could have recorded my own gameplay for this event, but I left my laptop at the apartment, so I'm rocking with the B-roll that the team had provided for us. Now, much has been said about Metaphor Refantazio when it comes to basically being Persona, but fantasy. And while true, I found it to be much more than that, and even course-correcting in a subtle manner some of the series' core mechanics. More than anything though, I feel like walking away from this, I understand that Metaphor Refantazio feels like a direct answer to Fire Emblem's current trajectory. Fire Emblem's latest entry in 3 Houses adopted much of Persona's template and, in my opinion at least, did it far worse. Still, the idea was there, 3 houses or kingdoms at odds with one another in a fantasy setting and some social elements mixed in. Ironically, a lot of those elements are shared here in Metaphor Refantazio, and it's extremely cool to see the team at ATLUS be able to flex their creative muscles in an entirely new world, one free from the shackles of our own. Heck, there's even attention to detail down to the shaders they use on the character models, which create this storybook look and feel. If the time I spent with Metaphor taught me anything, it's that ATLUS is in arguably its best stretch ever between games like SMT5 and Persona 5 Royal, and they just may have another hit on their hands. From the stylish and thoughtful combat to the budding social systems I experienced across its immediately interesting cast of characters, I have not stopped thinking of Metaphor since I played it and simply can't wait for the full game to be in hand. You know, once Avowed got delayed, I mean, Metaphor became my most anticipated game of the year. So I'm just very relieved to say, out of everything I've been previewing as of late, which has been a lot, and thank you for watching these videos to make those opportunities possible, Metaphor, head and shoulders, cleared everything I played. Now, I am going to talk a bit about this story, but not in a heavy spoilery way of like documenting the moment-to-moment things that are happening here in Metaphor Refantazio. I'll leave that to you to discover. But in the terms of story, elements, and themes, and even how the main character functions in this world, I was quite surprised the direction that Metaphor was going in. Let's start off at the top. Things open up with the death of a king and its surrounding nations are being sent into a spiral. It's then you quickly learn that the main character is fully voiced, so there's no gender selection, and perhaps more surprising is how defined your character is. While ones like Joker, Yu Narukami, and Makoto Yuki have had stories of their own, the games did a well enough job of letting you step into their shoes and experience the world through their eyes. Your character's best friend is already chosen for you in the son of this king that just passed, you're a part of a race that's scarce, and you're on a mission to take out the Kingslayer from within. The why behind all of this I will leave to you to discover, but I was really shocked when I learned all this within my first hour of playing the game. It didn't rob me of anything, just to be clear, and it actually immediately attached me to my character in a new way, and in a different way than I get attached to a Persona protagonist. So I like how this immediately felt very different. Like, if there's one thing I'm going to overemphasize this video, it's that Metaphor Refantazio isn't just fantasy Persona, even down to its gameplay. We'll get into that. It's very different, but also on a story level, like tropes that you come to know and love. Like, we'll get into your favorite best friends in all these Persona games. Very different here when it comes to Metaphor. There's also an interesting approach to the themes of the game that I don't really understand. You'll name yourself, and more on that in a second, then you'll name your character. So yeah, there's a difference between the two. Like, you'll give yourself a name, and then the character you're playing as a name. and much of the game speaks to the ugliness of humanity itself. While there's a multitude of races like the Elmas and Parupases, humans are the main baddies in this world, and those humans are mangled, ugly beasts. Your protagonist carries a book around that features a story where the world lives in harmony and all are equals, which is a stark contrast from the world you're in. You, as in your name and not the main character's name, is actually referenced in this book, and you can kind of already start to put together where they may want to go with this. A lot of the initial commentary for the game feels like a reflection of our current world state, and as this team is known to do, does not shy away from tough subjects like racism, for example. What I will say though, from my experience, is that this game hammers you with cutscenes early on. And if you've played an ATLUS game, you've come to know to expect this. But a lot of Metaphor's marketing, particularly in the gameplay department, has sold a more action-focused experience, but make no mistake, this game has you sit down and really take it all in. I'm talking like an hour of just straight cutscenes, and the occasional, very rare occasional battle. There's a lot of building up before this game really lets you go. Much like you'd find in, say, Persona 5, like, go to bed, Joker, do this, Joker. Like, you're being told what to do and following a pretty strict path for a while before the game lets you loose. Like, sometimes there were mere seconds of gameplay where I take 10 steps and then there'd be more dialogue. Now, early characters introduced to you in this game I found to be such a breath of fresh air compared to your usual JRPG cast in ATLUS game. So instead of your first pal being a Junpei or a Yosuke or a Ryuji, your dude bro who's gonna be a bit of an idiot, it's the stoic yet noble Stoll that steps into that role. A tragic character with his own motivations for enrolling in the army. There's also Grius, a fierce warrior with an eye patch and a Scottish accent to boot, and naturally you can bond with these characters, and I saw there were 14 different bonds you could form, which falls a bit lower than Persona 5 Royal's 24 confidants. But here's why this excites me, and keep this in mind, this is coming from someone where Persona 5 Royal is one of my favorite games to ever exist, and I must emphasize one more time, it's what made me want to go and make a game and not just play them any longer. The confidants at times in these games felt like they solely existed merely to advance mechanics rather than marrying them to interesting stories like the series sometimes fails to do in all Persona entries. So to thin it out a bit can hopefully, I don't know yet, lead to more meaningful progression in both storytelling and gameplay upgrades. That's all I'm gonna say on the story right now, but early on, I really got hooked by its characters. I love the premise, I love the themes. It felt very unique. Like, I don't think I've played a fantasy game quite like Metaphor, and that's one of the best compliments I can give it, because I'm a very selective fantasy fan. I'll like some kind of typical fantasy stuff like Kingdoms of Amalur, but really, I'm an Elder Scrolls fan, for example, but I'm not a fantasy fan always, or I like the very peak fantasies like Lord of the Rings. But I feel like Metaphor has found its own pocket as this fantasy JRPG, and I'm very excited to explore it further and learn more about its characters and its story, because some of the designs for these characters too are just sick. But that's enough on story. Let's talk a bit about this gameplay. Pretty much this game is an action turn-based hybrid, so you'll wail away at enemies and have to put them into this stun state. Time will slow down, and that'll allow you to enter turn-based combat. And I do wish that you can engage multiple enemies with this in turn-based combat. So for example, if you attack one enemy and then start the turn-based fight, but there's a second enemy nearby, they won't be drawn into that encounter. Now, this is different from the game that first did this in Trails Through Daybreak, which released in Japan in 2021, and it's now available in the US this year. This game shares a similar hybrid system, except fights take place in the world map itself. So if I engage one enemy, but there are 3 nearby, then all of them are pulled into the battle. In Metaphor, I would have to fight all 3 of those enemies back to back to back, and that is a bit of a bummer because I can see it becoming a bit redundant over time. Also different is that you can turn Daybreak into a full-on action game where you could smack around enemies as long as you want to maximize DPS. Metaphor pretty much forces you to jump into turn-based anytime the enemy is stunned. Again, this is not bad, but with this perspective of mine, it does feel a touch limited, but it does also solidify that Metaphor is way more turn-based than action. Now, on that same note, it's also worth addressing that this game isn't like Final Fantasy VII Remake's combat either. The ratio of turn-based to action is like 90-10, where the action is just to set things up, and everything else after is a fully turn-based fight in my experience. Now, what else is new here? Well, I'll start off with something familiar in that you can target certain body parts in big fights like you did in Persona 5 to weaken particular elements of the boss. It seemed a little more interactive in Metaphor, but in terms of something brand new I saw early on, there is a frontline backline system that I really like. So the frontline does more damage with melee, but also will take more damage, and the backline will do less melee damage, but also take less damage, and magic damage from my testing seemed to be unaffected. So this allows some strategizing in defending by moving to the backline plus activating defend to minimize even more damage than you actually might expect, meaning the opportunity for the enemy to hit you super hard is there if you're not prepared for it. But the game, as ATLUS turn-based games typically do, has a great job of communicating to you like when that big attack is coming in, allowing you some time to prepare. In the terms of difficulty, because I understand a lot of people thought, hey, Persona 5, like great game, but really easy. I think it's too early to say right now, but I can confidently say I did not struggle at all with the early fights in Metaphor, but since things were so heavily guided, I don't know if they really, as the developers, wanted me to struggle. The first boss fight I got into, like it was pretty easy just to breeze through this thing because they were introducing mechanics in things like archetypes, which let's talk about that now. So there's this thing called the archetype grid. Archetypes are the embodiment of royal power and effectively your personas in this game. This is pretty much the closest one-to-one I can give you. They allow specific users to control magic without any sort of magicite accessory. So you'll spend magic crystals here, and you can upgrade your archetypes where they represent the game's various spells. So an example would be upgrading the Seeker means you get better wind spells. You can also train other party members to wield different archetypes. So I took Stoll's warrior archetype, spent some magic crystals on Grius's, and now he has access to it. What this does is pretty much turns everyone into what originally the MC in Persona could only do. And for those who haven't played, Persona games historically allowed the protagonist to wield any personas while party members have only one that can gradually evolve. So what I'm pretty much beckoning you to do here is imagine a Persona game where the MC and all the party characters are on the same level. Like Makoto is not limited to Johanna. She can go ahead and like equip Izanagi, for example, if she wanted to. That's what this archetype system lets you do. And the benefit of that, from what I can see on the outside, again, not fully tested out, I only had 2.5 hours, is I get to kind of feel out the build quality there. I can change everyone's purpose in combat. Obviously, with the stats that they come built in with, certain characters are built for certain options, like they're more melee focused or more magic focused. Like that's always gonna happen, but you can really toy around with some cool options here because anyone can use anything. You can also press the left stick to retry any of the fights if you're having trouble or if you don't like how things are going. So that's a new quality of life enhancement there. And there are other parallels that do exist here across Metaphor to Persona, like bonds are confidants or social links. Archetypes are Persona. There's a similar button layout in combat and the UI display. And of course, the visuals speak for themselves. I mean, I don't know quite yet, but these might be the best menus ATLUS has done. I know the bar is set really high, but I mean, I was slipping and sliding through some of these menus and just, there was one shot of like the protagonist just looking to the side, and there was another of like just his like legs and his feet that I was like, why is this kind of raw too, man? Like, I don't know. There are some sick menus in this game, which I expected from ATLUS, but I feel like they've outdone themselves here. But one thing I did mention is that social gameplay. Now, this actually was not available at the event I went to in New York City. Those of you who've been watching a lot of my coverage know I went to LA for a separate event for Gamescom LA, which was hosted by Xbox, and one of the games there was Metaphor. So when I saw that there, I went, all right, check, I already saw that one. But when they told me that this was the same demo for New York City, I especially thought, well, I don't need to play this then. But then I saw someone playing it and doing the daily life gameplay. I went, wait, hold up. I didn't get that. So I actually got to sit down with Metaphor a second time and experience a little sliver of the daily life gameplay and how things flow with that title. It was about a 30-minute block, so it wasn't like you could get the full constant flow, but I did get to hang out with party members. I did get to try out some of the activities. And so what happens is this: you have the gauntlet runner, think of this like your ship, and you have a map. And when you look at this map, you're like, okay, I can go here, 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 and here. And they'll all take X amount of days, pretty much. This is also, by the way, I should just add, and we'll talk about music last, the part where the soundtrack just starts to slap. But again, more on that in a moment. But now you're on this gauntlet runner. So let's say I'm gonna go to this cave and it says like, okay, it's gonna take 2 days for you to get there. So now you have 2 days to engage in the social activities. What this allows Metaphor to do is something that, as I've critically thought about Persona 5 Royal in hindsight, I think that a lot of this series' social gameplay is great. I think the sim elements are there, and it's what really makes the series stand out. But I do wonder if you could kind of intersperse more of the turn-based gameplay throughout that. So my understanding is that once you arrive to these locations, like the social gameplay ends and it's back to the dungeon diving part of the gameplay. And what I like about this is it means that you don't seem like you're going to be going on these massive stretches in Metaphor Refantazio where it's like 20 days of just school life, or in this case, being on a ship. It's like maybe a handful. Again, I have to see this system fully to see how expansive things get and how many days it takes to get to certain places. But I remember there was one point I was reading and the character was just chilling in the nook. There was another time I was hanging out with Hulkenberg, I believe her name was, like this awesome redheaded elf chick that I am so into. I think she looks so cool. So I was really hyped to learn more about her character. And there's one point where she's like sitting on Stoll's back. Like the interactions are already great. But one thing I can say for sure, what I picked up across these two previews is that this game drops a lot of, I think, the fan servicey elements that were found in Persona. It takes itself a lot more seriously, a lot more seriously. And that's one thing I do want to emphasize here, because I know some people get put off by Persona because of that sort of stuff, like being able to date your teacher, for example, and I get that. But it doesn't feel ever so present here, at least in the early goings. It feels like it takes itself extremely seriously. So we'll see how things evolve in that department. The last thing I want to inform you on is the music. So this marks a very different approach to Shoji Meguro's usual soundscape many of us know and love. Instead of the pop and vibey music you find in Persona, you're met with an ensemble of medieval tracks, typically with Gregorian chants attached. Now, I'll be honest, I heard these songs originally out of context on YouTube and they didn't excite me at all. Not like I listened to it and went, oh, I hate this, but I heard them and went, yeah, I think I got a preference here for sure. But with context, I will say there was one moment during this preview, which this is tough to do. You're in like a social setting. You're not in your usual gameplay environment. You're not a little cozy and everything, like you're out in public. But this soundtrack did give me goosebumps. Like it pierced the veil in only a way ATLUS can do. So it had me very much excited for what Shoji can pull off in this sort of avenue. So it just feels like the whole team is flexing creatively. When we did the Q&A afterwards, they seemed really excited about the product. There wasn't really any new answers, anything there. It was just like, thank you for coming. We appreciate you. That sort of energy, which is always very much appreciated. And I was happy to be there. This is really cool for me because I've typically been invited to game previews for stuff that's in my wheelhouse. Like, oh, you cover Xbox, come to the Xbox event. Or you cover Bethesda, here's the Bethesda event. And sometimes I get to go a little bit broad, like a Ubisoft digital preview or something like that. But to kind of get invited to a JRPG event was really cool. I was like, this is stuff I'm extremely passionate about. And so to be there and see this sort of event was a different environment for me, and it was really fun. Like there were people there I didn't recognize at all, so it was just a totally new world for me. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, those are my thoughts on Metaphor Refantazio thus far. I loved my time with the game, and I'm very excited to see how things evolve. And no doubt this game will probably end up giving me an existential crisis like Persona 5 Royal did. Again, that's what led me to being in dev. I was like, oh my God, what am I doing with my life? This is so good. And I'm making YouTube videos. Like, I need to go do something else. And so that's where it led me. So I'm curious what Metaphor does to me as a human being, but shout out to ATLUS, shout out to Sega. Appreciate the invite. Really excited to see where this game goes. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I leave it in your hands. What do you think of Metaphor Refantazio? Did this preview answer all of your questions? Let me know down below. Other than that, take excellent care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time around. Stay sexy, stay active, and love you all. Peace.